Okay, we will move to item 3.2. Vice Chancellor Garcia, thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Chairman. No better. I sit here
Yes.
quite a bit.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chairman Himmelstein, Chancellor Scott, and members of the Board of Governors. I appreciate being able to present to you after lunch as opposed to before when you're all hungry and thinking about what's next. And I should explain the arm for
Why is it
sake
purple?
of it doesn't hurt anymore, but yeah, I was just in the Call of Duty, fighting the good fight for community colleges. We'll do whatever it takes. So what I'm going to do today is give you a very high-level summary of some of the key developments that are occurring at the state level and at the federal level. You have in your briefing agenda materials in item 3.2 your legislative updates, state legislative update as well as federal updates, which you can read if you have specific questions about a variety of bills. But I'm just going to focus on the high level and then spend some time talking about what we might expect next year as we prepare for the 2012 legislative session. So as you probably all know at this point, the governor took final action on all legislation on at midnight, October 9th. And we're pleased that he did sign into law 2 of the Board of Governors sponsored bills, major bills that are very much complementary and part of the Student Success Task Force work, and that was to establish a common assessment with the passage of AB 743 by Assemblymember Block that now requires the Chancellor's Office to establish a common assessment to be used by colleges around the state. And then AB 1056 by Assemblymember Fong. This would, if funding is available, require colleges to begin providing electronic transcripts for students, and they would have to have these systems in place by the end of the year 2012. So we're delighted that they saw the value of your sponsored bills and that they've been signed into law. A handful of other bills that were signed into law that are worth noting. AB 194 by Assemblymember Beal. This is the bill that establishes for the first time that foster youth students will get priority enrollment in the community college system, right up there with veterans priority. And this is significant in a recognition of the work we do for foster youth in our system. There are about 7,000 foster youth, so it's not a significant number. In the past, these are students who were included in the EOPS programs, and they would get enrollment priority through that program. But because that program has been cut so dramatically, a lot of them have fallen out of the system. So this is a very important bill for us, or law. AB 684, which you had as an item earlier, which established it enabled local community college districts to request the Board of Governors to give them a waiver to provide district area elections as opposed to district-wide elections. And you'll be obviously dealing with that in the months to come as more and more college districts seek your approval to shift their districting areas. And then there was AB 131 and AB 130. These are the 2 DREAM Act bills authored by Assemblymember Cedillo. These were both signed into law. One bill, AB 131, is the one that for the first time allows AB 540 students who meet specific requirements to gain in-state residency fees to also be eligible for state-funded financial aid, which includes Cal Grants and institutional aid, and in our case, it would include the BOG fee waiver. So obviously, you've read about that, and you know the significance of that. Then the second related measure is AB 130, and basically this one just reiterates that DREAM Act students can also be eligible for private-funded financial aid. So those are 2 bills that we'll probably be hearing a lot more about, and significant for the students in our system since we serve probably about 36,000 exempt students, AB 540 students. Then the last set of bills that I want to bring to your attention are the veterans bills. The governor signed 3 veterans bills that are really significant, and I think really speaks to his interest in veterans issues. He also he just recently signed an executive order urging the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to coordinate with different agencies in the state to better serve veterans. So he seems to be sending a strong message about his commitment to helping veterans. And the 3 bills that he signed were AB 636 by Assemblymember Knight. And this is a bill that would say if a military individual is called to active duty and they're enrolled in community college classes, that they would get a full refund at whatever point they have to leave to go to active duty. The second bill, AB 882 by Assemblymember Cook, this bill basically says that veterans who are stationed and in active duty in California are eligible for in-state tuition, which of course that's a significant benefit for them. And then the last bill, which was authored by the Veterans Committee, SB 813, this is a bill that basically says veterans will get enrollment priority for 4 years as opposed to the 2 years, which is established already in state law. So I think that there's a clear appreciation for the need to support veterans, and especially a growing appreciation for the number of veterans that are coming to the community colleges. So, you know, as we prepare for the upcoming Veterans Summit, this will be something that should be very important to state legislators and the governor. Let me talk a bit about what we learned. I mean, this is Governor Brown's first legislative session where we were able to take a look at his actions. And there were we learned a little about his style and his priorities, and a couple of take-home messages that I think can help us in preparing for next year is, one, we can't pigeonhole him. I think that many of his final actions both pleased and disappointed constituents across the board, from Democrats to Republicans to labor to social justice. A lot of different groups were able to get bills signed that they felt strongly about, and also had to accept some vetoes. So he has really a lot of people have said somewhat unpredictable in his actions, but I think what we really did learn is that he really goes through the policy, delves into the policy issues. We talked with a lot of his senior staff that he spends a lot of time really asking several questions. One is, do we really need this legislation? And 2, what's the fiscal impact? Is there fiscal pressure or fiscal costs? And of course, that's obviously a key consideration when signing legislation. We also learned that this year that he is not particularly fond of overutilizing data. So that's something that we'll need to think about as we move forward and talk about proposals that include the use of data to guide our decision making. And then he also was very involved in signing a lot of the veto messages, or drafting a lot of the veto messages, and making strong points to legislators as he reviewed their bills. For example, one legislator was pursuing legislation that would have established a fee on a particular item, and he made the point that, you know, while you would like to add this fee, you haven't been supportive of tax increases. And so, you know, he used the veto message strategically and pointedly in several cases. So for next year, obviously the budget is going to continue to dominate all the discussions in the legislature. We also can expect a lot of discussion about pension reform. The governor has already released a 12-point plan for proposed changes to our current pension system, already getting a lot of reaction. And then also, it's an election year. So next year, as a result of the redistricting and really the musical chairs, you might say, there are a lot of legislators who are pursuing a new office. And the deadline for filing final papers to run is coming up, I believe, this week. So we'll have a much better sense within the next month of which legislators will be pursuing other offices. But suffice it to say, we have a good idea of already who's running, and there are probably a good majority of the legislators in both houses are going to be running for an office. It's going to be a significant election year. So for community colleges, how do we deal with this very unstable environment and getting our message across? Well, I think the strongest message we have to bring to the legislature is we're not just sitting around waiting for the economy to turn around or for the budget to all of a sudden not be running a deficit. We're doing what we can now with what we have. We're not saying it's sufficient. We're not saying we don't need new resources, but we are saying that we spent this last year examining every possible way we can to increase efficiencies in order to reinvest in student success. And it requires some change, and that change is hard, but in this kind of environment, it's critical that we take those steps, and that's what the Student Success Task Force recommendations say to the legislature. We have been working hard. You told us you wanted change, you wanted to see us reprioritize, refocus. We said, let us do it. We're the experts, and this is the product that we've come forward. So I think whether or not there's disagreement about the entire package, parts of the package, the one thing that everyone will agree to is we did take our job seriously. We had a broad cross-section of stakeholders and vested interests participate in this process, and that we can come to the legislature and say, this is the product of our work, and we have been taking seriously and doing something. So I think we're in a very strong position to say, we're here, we're serious, we believe we're part of the state's solution to reinvigorate the economy. So I think that along with what actually emerges from the Student Success Task Force in terms of legislation, that would be the overriding message that we would say, and here's what we need to do legislatively. Now, in the report, you've noticed that there's a section that is titled Implementation. And in there, it says, will require legislation or statutory change or regulatory change or policy change. We're in the process of going through every one of those recommendations and examining what we think would be the best route to take. Because in some cases, you can pursue statutory changes or regulatory changes. And you just have to evaluate what is the most prudent approach to take. So we're going through that process, and of course, next week, the task force will be meeting, may possibly make some changes to the recommendations. So we'll wait to see what emerges from next week's meeting. And what I plan to do is in December, when you meet for a special meeting in December, to at least have a summary of the bills that we think we will need to introduce to support the Student Success Task Force recommendation. So I'll have that outlined for you. In addition to student success, because that is our major priority for the upcoming year, we do have one other bill, and that's the reauthorization of economic development and the economic and workforce development. It sunsets in the year 2013, so next year is the year that we would seek a reauthorization, and the statute basically requires us to reauthorize in 5 years. So we actually are taking a look at existing statute, working with a group of stakeholders, the FAC, the League, and others, and getting input on whether or not it's time to revisit some of the priorities and framework around the economic development and economic and workforce development statute. And of course, this is being done under the leadership of our new Vice Chancellor, Quinn Liven. So we will have probably a proposal that will seek reauthorization, but also possibly include some modifications to refocus, and streamline according to what this current economic environment needs in California, and how we can, of course, address those needs most effectively. So what we'll do is come back to you in December, and then in January you will vote on your package. And for the sake of new members, just to explain a little bit about the Board of Governors process, is the Board of Governors actually votes on your sponsored package. And we typically have from 2 to 3 bills that are included in that package. And that means we are the sponsors, we dictate the direction and contents of that legislation. And we find an author who wants to carry your legislation. And so that's what you will be voting on in January. We are not going to be entertaining a lot of other bills because we have our hands full with Student Success Task Force recommendations. And then on all the other bills, you have, through an executive order, you have delegated the authority to the Chancellor and Government Relations to evaluate positions to take on various bills based on a set of principles that have been approved by the Board of Governors. So we use that as our guideline to take positions on bills so that we're able to take timely positions and work on amendments and be responsive to legislators. So that's the summary for the state legislative report. I'm happy to take questions, or I can move quickly into the federal report.
Just, I'll make a comment, and then Member McDougal. Marlene, I guess I was, and maybe this goes into our next subject a little bit, but I actually was surprised and actually rather pleased that in the draft report of the Student Success Task Force, how many of the implementation requirements were actually Board of Governors regulations. And knowing what I know about creating and passing legislation, I actually was delighted that we have the opportunity to consider as a board such significant changes, and we may have different ideas whether we should or shouldn't do it, but it really honed in and pointed out the areas that we could have some significant influence over. And I don't know, it almost looked like it was 50-50 or maybe even more toward Board of Governors regulations. Is that your impression?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the majority of actions that require some legal changes do fall under the Board of Governors regulatory authority. And there are a handful of recommendations that will require legislative change,
Yeah.
but the bulk of it can be done through regulation, which really underscores the important role you will play in implementation.
Right, which really goes to show what an important year this next year will be, and what I understand you'll be bringing back is a very, very clearly spelled out list of what those actions could be, and maybe a timeline or priority, assuming the form that we eventually approve or disapprove the task force report. Okay, Member McDougal.
Yes, thank you very much for your report, Marlene. I thought it was most helpful. The question I had, maybe it was not a piece of legislation this year. I thought that it was, but that was in terms of the student records, the K to 16 records, similar to Florida and Texas, where the student records come forth and you have that capability of really understanding with some specificity and depth the capabilities that students bring with them when they come into our colleges. And I don't know if that was not approved or it wasn't a piece of legislation. I thought that it was. But could you just
Sure.
inform me on that?
That was a piece of legislation that deals with the longitudinal data system, and Vice Chancellor Perry worked closely with Senator Simitian, and that bill was held in committee in large part to continue discussions with the administration regarding the use of data. So that'll be an ongoing discussion. It was not defeated, but it's still in committee. It was held for further discussion.
Member Malumed.
You were talking very fast, so I just wanted to clarify, when is the filing period deadline for people who might be interested in running for the legislature?
I believe it's either this week or next week.
Oh,
It's coming
okay.
up soon.
Okay.
And so then we'll have a much better sense of who's running for what offices, and my staff have been tracking that.
Well, I was going to share, I have read that there could be up to 42 new members in the assembly. So I mentioned that just for our board and other people to keep your antenna up, because there might be a lot of people in their neighborhoods that are campaigning that they might want to get to know also, because that's a big change.
Okay, go ahead and proceed, Marty.
Okay. So on the federal, many of you have been reading in the newspaper, and you certainly understand what's going on or not going on at the federal level and in Congress. But first of all, the Congress has approved a continuing resolution that will last until November 18th, which is next week, that they can continue to operate the federal government. Now, unless they pass another continuing resolution, which I assume they will have to, they will stop functioning because they still are working on various budget matters. Both appropriations subcommittees in Congress have really been looking at budget cuts. The House has taken action, and it was their Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, Human Services, and Education to determine where they might cut for the upcoming budget year. And they came up with budget cuts of about $4 billion, lower than the 2011 budget year. And one feature of that proposal is that they were very strict in trying to ration Pell Grant participation. So for example, one of the items that they would eliminate is Pell Grants for part-time students. So that's obviously something we'll want to monitor, and it has a significant impact on community college students. And in our system, it's about 70-some% of our students who are part-time. The Senate version of that same process of this Appropriations Subcommittee did go through a similar process, but their cuts amounted to $308 million. So obviously a very big difference in what the House and the Senate have come up with in terms of proposed cuts. And in the Senate's case, they did keep Pell Grant maximum awards at $5,550, and they have retained a lot of funding for a lot of the career technical education programs. So obviously this is fluid, this is not reflective of what's going to be adopted, but it just gives you an indication of where they are in terms of the two houses and where they're looking at programs for next year. You also have the super committee that was adopted or established as a result of their Budget Act that was signed into law this summer. And they have until November 23rd to come up with a plan to cut the $1.5 trillion from the budget between now and the next 10 years. They've been fairly quiet. We have not heard a lot about what they're discussing, but if they don't, they have until November 23rd to come up with a plan, and then they have until December 23rd to sign that plan. And to sign that plan, 7 out of the 12 members will have to approve it. If they don't get approval, then that means that there are some automatic cuts that will go into effect by January 2013. And that would probably be an across-the-board type of allocation. Presumably, those cuts, the amount of the cuts would be split between military, defense, and discretionary funding, which is more of the domestic programs. So obviously, that would be significant. The president also, of course, you're reading that he has his jobs plan, and it has not been readily welcomed in the houses, but they continue to try to break apart the proposal and possibly save specific provisions. That has not worked terribly well thus far, but there is one provision that we're watching, and that's $5 billion for community college renovation and modernization, which obviously would be significant. And it's part of the largest portion of the president's jobs plan is infrastructure investment. And so that's something that we obviously would benefit from tremendously, but it's got a long road to go before it is approved, if it's approved. And I think that the focus is right now in Congress very much like California, you know, focusing on the budget deficit and what combination of budget cuts, budget tax increases. The president has also proposed his version of a budget proposal for the next 10 years, and his would propose, it's called the Plan for Economic Growth and Deficit Reduction. His would provide a net savings of $3 trillion over the next 10 years, but half of that would be through tax increases on the wealthy. So obviously you've been reading plenty about that, and there's just a lot of discussion about what combination of cuts, tax increases, and it's anyone's guess where these negotiations will end up. But for our purposes, Pell Grants, Career Technical Education Program funding, and eligibility requirements for Pell Grants will be issues that we'll be closely monitoring, and of course any funding that comes to us in the form of infrastructure modernization will be well accepted. So with that, I think that concludes my federal report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other comments for Vice Chancellor Garcia? Good work as always, Marlene. Thank you very much. We'll be looking forward to January.